Hello, welcome to this week's episode of Did Shakespeare. My name is Cassidy Cash, and this week we'll be asking the question, did Shakespeare have a birth certificate? This coffee mug I'm drinking out of this morning belonged to my great-grandmother. My grandfather used to drink out of it, and my mother gave it to me. And it's a funny thing to pass down, but I feel pretty connected to my family for having this little historical artifact. An interesting fact about my great-grandmother is that she didn't have a birth certificate. When my great-grandmother died, we didn't know how old she was, and it caused a problem for putting the date on her gravestone because we didn't know what date to put for when she was born. We know that they lied about how old she was so that she could marry my great-grandfather, but we don't know how old she was when she was born. Not exactly. We could get to within a couple of years, which is the way it works with William Shakespeare. You see, I have a picture of me with my great-grandmother. I'm a lot thinner in that picture than I am now. But I know that my great-grandmother existed because I met her and I talked with her, and I have historical artifacts about her life, like this coffee mug. But what I don't have is a birth certificate, and yet I'm still able to know that she existed and to know things about her life. And that's the way our study of William Shakespeare goes as well, because William Shakespeare did not have a birth certificate. We piece together what we know about Shakespeare's birth based on other pieces of historical evidence. It's a compilation of personal testimony and historical evidence. Birth certificates were not actually required in England until an official act was passed in 1836. Now, in 1538, way back before Shakespeare was born, Thomas Cromwell ordered churches to keep records of all baptisms, burials, and marriages. Notice that it does not include births. And this entire order by Thomas Cromwell was met with a massive amount of suspicion because people thought it was a stealthy way to start taxing Christian sacraments. There was a little bit of tension, you might remember, between the Catholics and the Protestants, and people were a little uptight about what they could worship and what they couldn't, and religion was a tense topic. And so they were worried that Thomas Cromwell was instituting this law to try and tax them on their religious rights. What it turned into, though, was the record turned into a way for people to prove their legal right to inheritance of property. And by the 1700s, people were getting baptized, even if they weren't religious, in order to have a legal right to inheritance. Obviously, there were a host of problems with this system, including human error and people recording things that didn't actually happen. So by 1812, there were updates that were passed. But as I mentioned, it would be 1836 before there was any legal requirement that birth certificates be put together at all. During Shakespeare's lifetime, this was not an established thing to do. William Shakespeare was born in 1564, and the records were kept in the churches on paper of the baptisms, and they weren't very well looked after, so they were starting to fade. By the year 1598, they started copying these records over onto parchment, which was much more durable and had a longer lifespan. In 1600, a clerk copied over records of William Shakespeare's baptism and the baptism of his children over onto parchment paper. So the records that we have today aren't actually the original records, but instead are a copy of the original records that were created to preserve the records themselves. Now, we know that the records are accurate because they were verified and signed by a vicar and 5 church wardens. But this brings up the question of how do we know what we know about historical figures? Do we need everything we know about William Shakespeare to be verified in a scientific way? Should we be able to prove Shakespeare's birth in a court of law in order to believe that he was a real man that actually lived? It's an interesting question, but one that studying history causes you to ask because you can't always prove beyond a shadow of a doubt what you know. There's a phrase that my friend uses that I love to this day, and it's the idea that you do your best until you know better, and then you do better. And with historical evidence and historical study, you piece together the piece of evidence that you have to form a picture of what you think happened. And you function with that framework until you learn something new or discover a new piece of evidence that changes what you thought you knew about the past. It's what makes learning and historical exploration so much fun because there's always the opportunity to discover something new that's going to change what you think you know. And it's what makes learning about William Shakespeare such a constantly fun thing to do, because there's always more history to explore about this extraordinary man. That's it for this week here at Did Shakespeare. I'm Casty Cash, and I hope you learned something new about the Bard. Don't forget about the show notes to this week's episode. You can look below, and you can also come over to castycash.com and find freebies like an entire hand-illustrated life map of William Shakespeare's life that outlines some of these facts that we know about William Shakespeare. Thank you for learning with me, and I'll see you next week.